Hello, welcome to Zoonosis with Joy. I'm Joy, and today we're going to be talking about megafauna, large animals and the roles they play in environment and health. I'm going to talk a little bit about conservation and a little bit about what can be done to help megafauna. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you like the thing, do the comment, do the subscription, do the like, share it around, that kind of thing. Just keeps me motivated. So megafauna just means large animal. It's kind of an arbitrary definition, right? So chimpanzees aren't megafauna, but gorillas are. We're megafauna because we're large, we're big, and so we got to make the rules, baby. When we think about megafauna, it tends to be kind of an arbitrary threshold of around 100 pounds, 45 kilograms, that kind of thing. However, there's different definitions depending on ecosystem. So sometimes we're talking about like benthic organisms living at the bottom of water columns and like lakes and oceans and that kind of thing. Or like in the dirt, fossorial organisms, digging organisms, that kind of thing. And those are usually measured by length, not necessarily by weight. And so there's some sort of like definitional kind of struggle there. We often think of very, very large megafauna as like megafauna. So things like elephants, dinosaurs, that kind of thing, those are megafauna. And there's also kind of a zoological taxonomic sort of vibe to this too, right? So, we think about like beetles. When you think like, something the size of an apple, we don't think of typically as megafauna, but among beetles, that's pretty big. So like your atlas bug, that kind of thing, your atlas beetle, I should say. They're not bugs. Those are quite large. I'm more focused on the ecological kind of definition here. The thing is that megafauna are keystone species. And I'm not an engineer, but in engineering, a keystone is a part of a bridge, an arch bridge, that basically prevents the whole thing from collapsing. You lose that keystone's piece, the whole ecosystem falls apart. So what exactly are these sort of organisms doing? I'm glad you asked. So keystone species like megafauna, they often have very long life histories. They're case selected. They have very few offspring. They use a lot of resources, that kind of thing. And this means that they often have a disproportionate sort of weight within the ecosystem, not just by size. I mean, the size is important because that's embodied carbon, but also the energy that they're moving around and the effects that they kind of do in the ecosystem. They're ecosystem engineers. You think about elephants. What do elephants do? Is they knock down trees. They do this because they think it's fun, and they just hate trees. They just hate them. So they knock them down. They can eat the leaves, but they just do it because sometimes you got to scratch an itch, and that means knocking over a tree, that kind of thing. Now, normally knocking down trees for the sake of it, that's something that we do, but elephants do it because it's fun for them. But this does good things in the case of the elephant, because if they knock down enough trees, they can create a patch. And in that patch, new plants can grow, new animals can take advantage of those plants, and you get what's called a mosaic ecosystem. So mixed woodlands, grasslands, that kind of thing, and these little meadow sort of structures. Not just elephants that do this, but many different kinds of megafauna often are ecosystem engineers. They're creating like water ditches, they're knocking down trees, they're doing all different kinds of things. They're often pooping and peeing everywhere, and often a large amount of it. And this can become a big resource for many different kinds of detrivore and decomposing sort of organisms. Insects, fungi, worms, they're all a bunch of fungi's, if you know what I'm saying. And they're often doing this kind of nutrient recycling. The bodies of megafauna are also huge sort of Lagerstätten for mother loads for the ecosystem, right? When we think about whale falls, dead whales basically. And what happens is when a dead whale bloats, it attracts all the sharks, and all the sharks come in and they eat little pieces of it, and fish do too. And obviously they get their fill and they swim away. But not all of the things get eaten by the sharks. A lot of the time, that carcass, once it stops bloating, it'll sink to the bottom of the ocean. And once it goes down the bottom column, it goes to that benthic sort of ecosystem at the bottom of the ocean. And you get lots of different kinds of scavengers coming in, hagfish and all sorts of like, starfish and sea stars, I should say, and like different kinds of crustaceans. They're all nibbling on this carcass. And what they do is they bring that nutrients into their own ecosystem. They're hunted by other sort of things. And this means that the nutrients, the carbon, the nitrogen, the calcium is spreading throughout the ecosystem. And so when you have these big carcasses, they often become very important for this kind of biodiversity to flourish. We also think about megafauna carnivores, our lions. The Tyrannosaurus rex was one of them too, right? Like these big carnivore species, great white shark, all that sort of fun stuff. What are they doing? Well, they're hunting other megafauna herbivores. They're preventing them from eating all the plants that other kinds of organisms are eating. They're hunting other predators basically as well. So they're preventing overconsumption of some of those primary consumers basically. So this helps regulate their populations and allows for more species diversity to kind of emerge. So there often are checking populations. And they can be really important in the functioning of these ecosystems altogether. So we often see that they're kind of doing these sort of functions. They're also often spreading seeds. So ground sloths. I'm thinking about like those giant ground sloths. You may think of like Ice Age, like Sid the Sloth. What were they doing? Well, they were eating lots of plants and a lot of fruits. Things like Joshua trees and avocados. And what they were doing, they were eating the full fruits and then pooping out the seeds everywhere. And this allowed these plants to reproduce. Megafauna move huge distances. They are traveling all over the place. And this allows plants to kind of move into new habitats, basically. And they often use the poop from these animals as a source of carbon, as a source of nitrogen, as a source of calcium, so they can actually kind of grow and flourish. Human beings actually took over the role of avocados, by the way, once those other kind of megafauna went extinct. So we think about megafauna. Human beings are actually one of the major causes for megafauna extinction. And this has huge knock-on effects, not just for ecosystems, but also for health as well. So you think about the last ice age, the mammoths, those ground sloths I mentioned. You think about Smilodon with the big teeth, or the woolly rhinoceros. But other places had like giant skinks and all sorts of fun stuff, right? All sorts of fun things happening throughout the world. I guess they were technically monitor lizards in Australia. I should make that clear. But anyway, these megafauna extinctions were caused by people. A big review came out last year that actually looked at the effect of climate and hunting from human beings on the megafauna extinctions at the end of the last ice age, the late Pleistocene, late Quaternary extinctions, basically. And they found that climate really wasn't a big factor. It was human beings and their big hulking brains with their projectile weapons just murking other animals for the sake of it because they thought they were tasty, and using their body parts, and probably also for fun too. Humans like killing things for fun, that kind of thing, right? So the killing of these megafauna basically caused major ecosystem catastrophe as human beings started spreading around everywhere. They basically started killing, and this happens into historical time, and we'll talk about that in a second. But the loss of these big megafauna herbivores caused some major problems down the road. So if you think about what they're doing, they're spreading seeds, but they're not just spreading seeds. Other things right along in the poop. I think about poop a lot. I'm a veterinarian, so I think about bacteria and parasites and all the fun stuff, the protozoans that are kind of riding along with feces. And when you lose those megafauna, they're suddenly lost their vehicle to move around. Now the populations are much smaller. They have much smaller home ranges. They're not spreading their poop around as much. And this can cause little basic, kind of pockets of populations that are, they're more isolated. It's like island biogeography, right? You got species that live on islands are less adapted for, protecting themselves against threats of invasive species, but also for pathogens too. So things like bacteria and parasites. And so the species that lost those megafauna no longer had to contend with all the bacteria and all the parasites. They suddenly didn't need to have that immunity anymore. That was until human beings started to domesticate the megafauna. They started to move around on the planet. Their cattle, their horses, their pigs, their dogs. And these animals were then becoming the new vehicle to spread all these different pathogens around. And what this caused was outbreaks of epizootic and epidemic zoonotic disease. So epizootics are between animals, and zoonotics are from animals to humans. And when you had that happening, you started to get the first major zoonotic outbreaks, right, in history. This seems to be what happened with measles. And measles is in the news because of some intellectual, ideological projects from some very bad people. But measles started off as a close relative of rinderpest, or rinderpest, right? And rinderpest is an extinct, thankfully, pathogen carried by cattle primarily, but human beings got a very similar sort of virus, measles. And this seems to have jumped from cattle as they started moving across the Eurasian steppe with their herds. And this seemed to move into Europe right around the time of Attila the Hun and the Germanic invasions at the late Roman Empire period. And it seems that the spread and the movement of these kind of animals and people together basically started to remix and started to move around all these new pathogens that everyone had basically lost immunity to. And this led to major outbreaks of infectious disease. So it seems that megafauna are playing a big role in keeping us protected against these things. If you lose the megafauna, you're no longer in the know, so to speak, about the kind of epidemic diseases that we were once immune to. So megafauna are important for that reason, and for the ecological reasons I stated earlier. Now, we didn't stop killing animals in the kind of late Quaternary, late Pleistocene. We actually continue to kill animals today. You may not know that, but the last 200 years especially, there's been a radical decline in the biodiversity and the numbers of megafauna. Now, the number one threat for megafauna across the planet is overharvesting, is hunting, right? And you think, well, what about climate change, habitat loss, that kind of thing? Not as important. We'll talk about that in a second. But it's actually human beings killing these animals directly. That seems to be the biggest factor. And think about it for a second, right? These animals, they don't have very large populations because there's not that much energy, there's not that much carbon, there's not that much physical space for them to move around in. So their populations are small, and they often reproduce slowly. So you kill a few members of the species off, they may not be able to replace that for years and years and years. This seems to be a big problem with the whaling industry. So you think about Moby Dick and all the, they used to go around in ships and having like gay misadventures with their shipmates, whatever. But they were also killing whales. And when they killed the whales, it took them decades for their populations to recover. Many of them still have not, after hundreds of years of the end of the commercial whaling industry. Now, certain countries still do commercial whaling to some extent, but it seems that it's much more limited now than it was back then. And still, yet a lot of these populations have not recovered because they are very slowly reproducing. And this has major knock-on effects for the ecosystem and for the epidemiological health, as I mentioned, but it is a huge problem because 1 billion, with a B, people in the world depend on the meat of wild-caught animals. Think about fish, think about bushmeat, think about all the different ways that people rely on wild animals for their food. We think of ourselves as living off of domesticated cattle, pigs, chickens, that kind of thing, and that is true. But the wild animals also play a big role in our diets. And this causes major problems because if we're over-harvesting megafauna in particular, this can cause these sort of major ecological and epidemiological problems. This also has some major sort of ecological and conflict-related things. When food insecurity gets higher, that means there's going to be more conflict for land and space and resources, and this can lead to war. When you have, less access to food resources and high population demand, this has been linked to child slavery, modern day child slavery, and overfishing. So overfished populations cause people to need more human resources to fish more populations, means that they start relying on children to reel in nets and to untangle lines and to do all these kind of work that were once done by adults. So the loss of the megafauna is a big problem. And a lot of this, is intentional wild caught. Now, habitat loss is also a big role. And habitat loss is largely because of human competition for agricultural and pastoral land. So, when I went to Belize a few years ago, probably about 5 years ago now, 6 years ago, 7? Time flies. But I got to talk with the Minister for Conservation in Belize, and he was telling us, the Westerners, of course, they want what's best. And so do the people of Belize. But Belize is a small country. They don't have a lot of money. And if you are a farmer or a rancher and a jaguar snags one of your cattle, or it's, you got like tapirs who are going into your field and eating all the crops, what are you going to do, right? You could not kill them and lose your kind of crop and that sort of thing in the hopes that tourists will come by and help you reimburse some of that losses. Or You supplement your own income with their hides, with their meat, with the medicinal parts that you can harvest off of them, that kind of thing. And so there is this conflict between the need for conservation and the need for economic subsistence in many of these cases. There's also a lot of problems too with the habitat loss because, the human needs for food is expanding. Our population is, starting to taper off, but people still need to eat food. And as climate change causes changes to land distribution, use patterns, that kind of thing, and food sources become less and less stable, we overfish this sort of things. That means we're going to need more farmland. We're going to need more ranching land. And this pushes human beings closer and closer into contact with these wild species and causes more of these altercations, as I mentioned. Urbanization also plays a role in habitat fragmentation. You put a big highway through a protected forest, you put a big shipping lane in a breeding zone for some manatees or something, that's not going to be good for them. It means there's going to be more human encounters and the likelihood of hunting increases as well. And there's also the problem of climate change, like I mentioned too. That's shrinking habitats. It's making water less available. It's making food less available. It's forcing animals to go more towards human areas and anthropogenic areas. And these wildlife get killed because of those kind of interactions as well. And there's also the fact that there is direct competition between our domesticated livestock, which have us with our big guns and our big brains to protect them, and the wildlife who don't really have anything. They just have their tusks, which we like for ivory keyboards and all sorts of fun, horrible things like that. So the effects of human actions play a big role in kind of the fates of these megafauna. What can be done about it? Well, I don't want to get too much into it. One of the things that people have suggested, and I think it's an idea, and I think that it may have some limited applications in marginal areas, is things like regenerative grazing, regenerative agriculture. And you may be thinking, well, hang on, those are domesticated megafauna. Those are cattle and horses you're talking about. That's, goats and sheep. Yeah. So in some cases, it could be useful to kind of help regulate the overgrowth of certain species, prevent wildfires, and that kind of thing. It could also be used for marginal lands which aren't good for agriculture, ranching on those kind of areas, and that sort of thing too. And, you can make some arguments that it's also less dense of agriculture than feedlots, and so less likely to cause epidemic, epizootic diseases and outbreaks, that kind of thing. And there's also an argument to be made that it's like a, kind of a more humane way of farming and ranching, that kind of thing too. However, the problem is, when we're talking about these kind of regenerative grazing systems, they're still intended for us. They're still intended for human consumption. The nitrogen is leaving the ecosystem. The carbon is leaving the ecosystem. It's not getting broken down by those detrivores. It's not getting scavenged or hunted off. It's ending up in our stomachs. It's ending up in our bodies. And it's ending up in our wastewater, which goes out to the ocean and becomes an algal bloom, right? It's moving across to entirely different places. It's going on freezer trucks and getting shipped across continents or across the world. So that's not necessarily a sustainable sort of method. It's not keeping the nutrients within the ecosystem. It's not supporting the animals within the ecosystem. It's just being used as a way of plant management. It's a way of using underutilized land. So, using these domesticated animals as a replacement for wild megafauna, not so much. I think that it may have a sort of role to play potentially, but maybe not a complete one. There's also something to be said about de-extinction, and I don't want to get too much into it. There's been a recent news cycle, which will come out of date in a month anyway, about de-extinction of some kind of charismatic megafauna. I think that this is silly. I mean, we all watched Jurassic Park, right? I don't want to reiterate and relitigate that necessarily, maybe in a future video. But the whole idea of bringing back a species into a world in which their ecological niche no longer exists is it doesn't make any sense, especially carnivore species. Herbivores, you could probably make an argument for mammoths. Again, they're highly intelligent, highly social species, the welfare aspects of that alone. And then there's also the argument to be made they're not really the megafauna, they're just transgenic, mutated animals that we already have around. Okay, well, yeah, and then that's just in the ethical sort of biotech sort of stuff, which, to be fair, that all makes sense. De-extinction has its role, I think, in the future, if we have the space and we are doing conservation. which is the more important aspect of this. And the conservation and rewilding, maybe a little less sexy than some of the other stuff we talked about, but yeah, I think it's pretty cool. Basically protecting lands and protecting areas that are important for megafauna and protecting wildlife corridors that allow them to move between habitats is very important to protect the functioning of these ecosystems as potential carbon sinks, as potential sources of biodiversity, as potential hedges against epidemic disease. And focusing on megafauna because of their role as a keystone species is very important, but they're also incredibly charismatic. You know, there's a reason that the World Wrestling Federation has used the panda as their logo for so long, for instance. The people like big, wonderful, majestic animals. They're a money machine. You know, you put that on your logo, you put that on your thing. You're not just protecting the animals, you're protecting their entire habitat that they're also walking around in. This is what I hear people saying, well, why do you protect the pandas? They're so bad, they should just be let to go extinct. Well, the panda ecosystem and the panda reserves actually protect huge swaths of ecosystem that other animals use. It's not just the pandas, it's their entire ecosystem and entire sort of life is linked to the land and linked to the animals and plants that they're interrelated with, right? And so focusing on charismatic species is also really good for protecting other kinds of animals too, not just because of their ecological and epidemiological effects, but also because of the way the human brain works. So it's also important to think about that too. This is going to be in direct conflict with some of our needs and some of our desires in terms of agriculture and food processing. And this is something that is going to be a big problem, right? We want to keep fishing in the oceans. We want to keep producing large amounts of beef. We want to keep like making soy for soy burgers or whatever. And for feeding, mostly for feeding cattle, to be honest with you. But we want to keep doing these kind of food producing things. We're going to have to learn that that's not necessarily a sustainable way of operating. We're going to have to make some sacrifices, baby. So it means that we're going to have to set aside certain lands that were once used for cultivation and setting it aside specifically for that. And this can't just happen in the third world. This has to, or the developing world, I think is probably the better term now. Places, the global south. I think that's the one I want to go with, the global south. We want to have everyone participating in this, in Europe, in the Americas. And we don't want to also push off the costs of producing food onto the global south, the developing world, the third world, what have you. There needs to be a global sustained effort for doing this kind of conservation, and there needs to be international cooperation. Now, we're not living in an era of international cooperation, and that is a big problem too. We have to learn how to work together in order to protect the planet and protect the megafauna. And so you can see how this rapidly becomes not just a problem of like, okay, let's just stop like harpooning whales, let's just stop like shooting the pandas and making like face masks out of them or whatever. It's a matter of how do we as human beings want to live on this planet? Do we want to treat it like an expendable resource, or do we want to have it available forever? How do we want to tread on this planet? And these need to be rigorously enforced by social norms and by laws and by international cooperation. And so that is kind of where you come in, right? So when someone starts saying stuff like, oh, well, pandas are useless, we don't need pandas, or we could just de-extinct things, or, you know, like, why don't we just like, you know, use cattle to regeneratively graze? You kind of know some things that you can kind of push back against and say, well, maybe there's a better way of doing things that way. And that's what I want to leave this video off for now. Thank you so much for watching. I mean, definitely my upcoming course in July, I'm super excited about that. We'll be talking all about domesticated animals, talking a little bit more about the wilderness and concepts of wilderness. So if you like that kind of part, or that kind of gets your brain going, definitely sign up for the course. It's going to be a lot of reading and some discussion, 200 pages a week for 7 weeks. Well, every other week, so it's like 14 weeks, that kind of thing. So, you know, 100 pages a week. If you can read that much and you're willing to sit and listen and discuss and that kind of thing, maybe it'll be good for you as well. Or, you know, if you just want to keep watching these videos, of course, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, share it around. It keeps me motivated. I'm almost near 1,000 subs. Thank you so much for watching. And, you know, I like to get my ideas out there. I like to hear what you guys have to say. It really does help. You know, I keep trying to improve things and tweaking things and that kind of thing. I'm not perfect. I'm doing this on my spare time, so I just want to learn and kind of do stuff. Anyway, I'm done talking. Thank you so much for watching.